So I'm here to speak about immigrant and multilingual parents and students in the special education process from the legal perspective. Um, and I, in that respect, there is federal law that governs education rights for immigrant and multilingual parents, so that will apply to a lot of you, regardless of the state that you are teaching in or joining us from. Um, with a few exceptions that might be, Massachusetts specific, but I'll just point out where it is Massachusetts specific. Um, so here, just a couple of learning objectives. Um, First being just to understand some of the legal protections for multilingual learners with disabilities. This is just kind of a taste of it. So hopefully it's the right balance in terms of, level of basicness versus, what you've all experienced. Learn to recognize common access barriers to learning for dually identified learners, so English learners, multilingual learners with disabilities, and also hopefully to consider in your role as an educator, as an advocate, as a social worker, however you're joining this conference, to consider ways that you can support dually identified students and their families. And just to mention that this artwork here is done by Luis Rafael, a dreamer in Chicago, and that was posted in his community throughout business, just kind of showing their solidarity with immigrants. Next slide, please. Okay, so here, just like to kind of set the stage, are the kind of multitude of experiences that immigrant and multilingual students and their families bring to school with them. With every interaction, every classroom interaction for students, and every interaction that parents have when they're interacting with school district staff, and from cultural stigma around disability, from homelessness. I know in Massachusetts right now, that is a huge issue with migrant families arriving and being unhoused. Interrupted education, the kind of balance between the parent and child relationship can tend to be skewed. Of course, economic and social factors, systemic racism and implicit bias among everyone that parents and students are interacting with in school. So this is just kind of to set the stage. And I put in the chat a Jamboard. If you could all please go there, just click on that link and indicate what barriers you're seeing now for immigrant families related to education access, and specifically if you have experience with dually identified learners, multilingual learners with disabilities, to also mention those. And even for families who, are entering the special education process on behalf of their children who were born in the US, attended US schools themselves, it's a daunting process. Limited access to technology for use at home. Assessment and knowing the issue is mental health or educational disability. Knowing what resources are available. Lack of access to prior education. For adult learners with disabilities, finding support for finding work. And I would add finding accessing special education for their children also when the parent has a disability is a huge challenge. Schools not providing translation appropriately, language and cultural differences, absolutely all of these things are huge factors that I know all of the time in schools, working with clients. So thank you. Okay, and here we have just kind of all of the information. And again, this is very nutshell information for the short period of time. But all of the information stems in some way from these three laws, which govern education access for immigrant students and their families, who are really important partners in their children's education. So the important thing to keep in mind, just by summary, there exists currently a federal right to public education, regardless of students' immigration status, their English language education status, their status as an English learner, or whether they have a disability, and that school districts have affirmative obligations to meet the needs of students, regardless of their primary language and regardless of their disability, where they have a disability that impacts their learning. Okay, and this is just every state also has its own laws also governing English language education and special education, and these are just our laws in Massachusetts. But I would encourage everyone to become familiar with the laws in your own state, which many times can be even more helpful than the federal laws in relation to education. Next slide, please. And here, this is just the special education process and the way that I'll be talking about the special education process in 3 main steps as multilingual learners with disabilities kind of pass through the process, and all students with disabilities, but I'll really focus on specific points for multilingual learners with disabilities, starting with the referral for an evaluation. The special education team meeting, and finally the development of the IEP and the parent response to the IEP. And actually, federal law, this 45 school working days is a Massachusetts law. It's 60 days, working days under federal law for the entire process to run its course from the point of parent consent for the evaluation. So parent participation, so crucially important. If any of you are parents of children with disabilities, or are advocates or educators of children with disabilities, you know the importance of parent participation and what a difference it can make to have a parent who is able to engage in the process of special education, advocating for what their children need, advocating when things aren't going quite well with their student because their needs aren't getting met in school. And it's not just me saying this. The law also says this, that parents are equal team members in special education, and that written letters, forms, and meetings must be in the parent's primary language in addition to English. And this includes using a qualified interpreter in special education team meetings, and in any communications with the school district. So it's crucially important. It isn't enough for the school district to kind of pull a maybe bilingual staff person into team meetings who aren't trained in the specialized terminology that's used, that aren't trained in the ethics of interpretation and confidentiality to serve as interpreter in those meetings. They really should have trained interpreters. Parent consent is required at certain key points throughout the process. And to give consent, of course, documents need to be in the parent's primary language or explained to them for parents who do not read in any language. Parent response is needed to the proposed IEP and placement before they can move on, before the school district can move on with the process. And I'm just going to be adding to the chat really quickly one more Jamboard, because I know that many of you are educators, and you this is probably a selected group of educators who have particular interest in working with immigrant and multilingual families. And I would just love to hear from you tips that you have in particular for engaging with immigrant families in special education or in education. Thank you. Reach out by phone, absolutely. And sometimes by text, sometimes my phone doesn't work. But really identifying the ways that parents need to can best engage with the school district, and really asking the question and understanding that. Invite them to school events. Yes, intentionally. And maybe not just circulating a flyer, but maybe doing that direct outreach, which, developing a relationship with parents in advance can also mean that when you reach out about a particular event, that they will, be more likely to come and give their input. So seek out their input, reach out early and often. Absolutely. Parents want what's best for their children. They want to engage. Um, and oftentimes they're just these uh, kind of different expectations that they may bring with them in relation to the relationship that they have with the school when they are new to the United States. Um, it may be, they may come from cultures where, you just defer to the experts. The experts know best, and, parents are not expected to really, assert themselves and assert, what their children need. And so really, pulling them into the process and showing them the value that they add and the difference that it can make when they participate is so crucially important. Um, there's somebody, I love that, trauma-informed approaches, absolutely. And trauma is one I should have mentioned with the wheel at the beginning. I mean, just assuming even that children who are arriving, to the United States, um, depending on the country that they're coming from, the circumstances, but are bringing with them some kind of trauma, adapting to a new country, maybe having experienced family separation. Um, don't give up. I love that. Some parents from cultures that shy away, patience, respect, don't assume anything. So thank you. You all have clearly a lot of important tips that for working with immigrant families and engaging them, which is just basic to student success. Okay, so referral and evaluation, identification of students with disabilities, including English learners or multilingual learners. So school districts or local education agencies, LEAs are legally required to identify students with disabilities in a timely way. This includes students whose primary language is not English. So it can be common in some school districts to kind of wait and see, when their first language is not English, to see if when a student is really struggling, they may have a 2-year, even I've heard in some districts, an unwritten policy of we're going to wait 2 years to see whether it's the language or whether there is a disability that's impacting that student's ability to make progress in school. That's illegal. As soon as a student is suspected to have a disability, that student should be referred for a special education evaluation. They're oftentimes, again, bring in parent communication, even asking parents, how was this student learning in their home country before they arrived to the United States? Did they have any particular struggles with school? Were there any particular strengths with school? What was their experience like with school before coming? They may have had even evaluations done or have received special services in their home country prior to coming to the United States. But a lot of that information, if parents aren't invited to share that information, they're not going to. And then we don't know that in school, they don't know that. And, may just be using the wait and see approach. But that's the really important thing. As soon as there's a suspected disability, that student should be referred for a special education evaluation. Testing must be done in a form or language most likely to accurately assess what that child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally. So this goes to test bias in testing. That student must be evaluated in their primary language if if they're more likely to be able to show what they can do in a language that's not English. And where there aren't validated testing tools in that student's language, it's really up to the evaluator to have kind of protocols in terms of testing protocols in, identifying ways to, understand what that student can do, what they're able to do, and the possible impact of any disability on that student's learning. Um, and testing must take into account cultural and linguistic differences. So again, be non-discriminatory. So, testing questions, the classic example, the testing question about, the wintry day and snow and building a snowman or something. And there may be students who have never seen snow. And so that's just kind of an easy example about bias in testing. Or if students are Muslim and maybe observing Ramadan and they're fasting, then maybe making sure to engage them in testing earlier in the day before they get very hungry later in the day. These are just examples, of ensuring that there isn't cultural bias kind of introduced into the testing process. Next slide, please. Okay, so are we on English language proficiency assessments? Yes, okay. Um, okay, so in Massachusetts, we use the WIDA access for English language proficiency assessments. Different states, some other states also use the WIDA access. I think that there's some other testing depending on the state that you're in. But the point is that that students, regardless of their disability, their English language proficiency must be evaluated and their progress monitored in terms of their English language development. Um, and this includes multilingual nonverbal communicators. So maybe based on the home language, they must be assessed in terms of their English language proficiency. And they may not be able to, the verbal portion, they may not be able to do, but the evaluator should have experience or collaborate closely with maybe a special educator to really be able to assess that student's language proficiency in the areas where they're able to participate. Maybe it's using an AAC, an augmentative communication device, that they're able to participate in the testing if they're a nonverbal communicator. But they must be assessed. And I know at least for the WIDA access test, there's an alternative version of it for multilingual learners with significant cognitive disabilities. But really it is to be used very sparingly to those students who really do have significant cognitive disabilities and are unable to engage in the regular access testing, or again, whatever testing system or instrument is used in your state. Okay, next slide, please. Which just, if the parent disagrees with the school evaluation, this is just a really important tool that parents have in the special education process, is the request for an independent evaluation, and which is like a second opinion to what the school evaluation says. So if the school district, for example, has not let's say evaluated the student in their language, and the parent feels that the results are skewed because of that. Maybe there are skills that the student was not able to demonstrate in the testing because of the language that it was done in, just to give one example. But there are many reasons why a parent may disagree with the school evaluations. Parents have a right to request the independent evaluation, and they have the right to request funding for that evaluation from the school district. And for low-income families, there's some special protections in terms of making that request. And this is especially useful for many immigrant students who may not have health insurance that funds private evaluators. So requesting that school district funding for low-income families who don't have the option of funding through health insurance can be really key. Okay, next slide, please. The special education team meeting. And I have a few tools to post in here in relation to this. So in our state in Massachusetts, this is where the IEP is developed, is the special education team meeting, of course, and it's an opportunity for parents to talk about the concerns that they have in relation to their children's learning. In our state, the State Department of Education, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, or DESE, suggests a pre-meeting with parents, especially those who are unfamiliar with the US school system. So just to explain to them the context, what they can expect, and to so that they can walk into the meeting better informed just about what to expect and what their role is in that team meeting. There is, some of you may be familiar with the US Department of Ed toolkit that was recently updated. I'm going to paste it in the chat, that has a chapter specifically on English learners with disabilities. There's also in 2015, the US Department of Justice and Federal Department of Ed issued a Dear Colleague letter focused on addressing the needs of English learners and their families and engaging them in education. And it includes just amazing tidbits in relation to use of interpreters, in relation to just education, instruction for English learners, and is probably the thing that I refer to most in terms of the federal guidance. So in addition, for the team meeting, parents can invite anyone who has knowledge about the process, and again, qualified interpreter. There isn't currently a system in place in most places for training qualified school interpreters, but that is something that we're working on in Massachusetts. We actually have a bill pending, and really importantly, there should be someone present at the team meeting who can speak to that student's English language development as it interacts with their disability-related needs. So that's crucially important, and I'm actually going to put that right in the chat. That's right in the Dear Colleague letter. Next slide, please. Okay, here we have the IEP for English learner students. A really important thing, that the IEP, where that student's English language education needs intersect with their disability-related needs, that student is entitled to both English language education and individualized specialized instruction and related services for their disability. So where there's that intersection, that student's English language education needs should be incorporated into the student's IEP. Next slide, please. This is again, the IEP, more on the IEP for English learners, that students' EL needs should be infused throughout the IEP to the extent that they do intersect or interrelate with their disability-related needs. In some cases, this means instruction for the student in their primary language, the student with a disability, and which maybe is going to require an educator who's qualified and experienced addressing that student's language acquisition and disability-related needs, either directly or if it's with a bilingual paraprofessional, they're going to need to be closely supervised and provided with training on what their role is in relation to that, addressing that student's disability-related needs while they're learning English. And then, of course, considering skills at home. So in the classroom, if that student is in an English immersion setting and is developing language, how is that going to how is that going to kind of interact with, or maybe even interfere with, generalization of skills to the home setting? which is a crucial part of special education. Next slide, please. So this is, and I hope we're looking at the same slide. It's issues to watch for in assessment and IEP development for English learners, which is just kind of a summary of some of what we've talked about, but oftentimes we'll have situations where two more minutes. Okay. These are just kind of a summary, and I've touched on some of these, but there's the over-identification, students with disabilities and under-identification also for disability that happens for many multilingual learners because school districts may not be really equipped to understand the needs of the duly identified learner. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. These are just again, and these are, Massachusetts, but every state has a complaint resolution process, just to be aware of where an agreement can't be reached with the team process. And that's a lot of what we do at Mass Advocates. And then the following slides are all resources for you all and for families. Many of them, the advocacy resources, are federal guidance, including some that I've posted in the chat. And then the last slide is just thanking you.